Recently, I was on a Christian news site. They actually do have like Christian news sites, kind of like a Christian version of Reuters. Um, but one of the things that I noticed on this one here is that when I was on it, I found an article that talked about a person who had been healed through the power of prayer. Now, a report like that, of course, on a Christian news site, it's like, you read it and it is news, but you're not surprised to find it on that website, right? It's a Christian news site. It actually is a site that tries to focus on who God is and God's glory, and just reporting on different things that go on around the world that really evidence what the church is doing and things along those lines. So to find a report on someone being healed by prayer, it's like, that's cool, but it's not surprising for the location. Anybody else would get on this website, they'd saw that, they'd probably roll their eyes. Oh, those crazy Christians, here they go talking about prayer and everything else again. But what made this unusual is not that the website itself was reporting on prayer, it was where the website found the information on this. There is a peer-reviewed journal, medical journal, and if you aren't familiar with peer-reviewed journal, basically it's an academic journal where a professional, someone who's in the medical field, in this case, or in any field, a professional in that, does research, writes an article, sends it off anonymously to a bunch of his peers, people who are, again, professionals in the field. They read over the article and approve it for publication. So this is something that people that do a lot of research, they'll go to these types of journals because they know that it has been validated, it's been backed up, it's been looked at, it's been shown to say, yeah, this is something that is scholarly and is acceptable, and that you can pretty much trust it. Well, the name of this particular journal was called Complementary Therapies in Medicine. So medical, then other things that kind of can assist the medical field. And so this was something that came out of an actual scientific journal. It's not something that just someone had written into the website and said, hey, I got healed, and they wrote an article on it. They found this in something that had been published nationally, and the people in the medical field who research this stuff and read these things would actually come across this. And that is what made it a little bit unusual. So I actually found the article, the actual real journal article, and printed it out and read it. And I understood about a third of it. Because it was just like, it was definitely a technical journal, a medical journal, but it told the story of a young man who, at a very young age, suddenly started vomiting just violently. And he was only a couple months old, and he just could not keep anything down. Anything they put in his stomach, he would just bring it back up. And it got to the point after trying different kinds of medicines and different kinds of therapies, they couldn't get it. So finally, they just installed at a very young age a feeding tube. And so for 16 years, this kid lived with a feeding tube. That was his source of nutrition because he could not handle anything. And then one day he and his family go to church, and they go to a church where they were praying for healing, and he goes up and have people lay hands on him, and they pray for him. And what he describes in it, it says that I'm going to read the actual quote from the journal. It's very scientific, so I apologize for the language here. But in November 2011, he experienced proximal intercessory prayer. That is the technical term of laying on of hands, in case you're wondering, okay? Leave it to a scientific journal to take out the mystique of prayer, right? So anyways, after experiencing this prayer at a church, he felt an electrical shock starting in his shoulder and going through his stomach. After the prayer experience, he was unexpectedly able to tolerate oral feedings. Again, scientific language, basically, he felt a shock go through his system, he felt it in his shoulder down to his stomach, and suddenly he could eat food. So people were curious about this. They start investigating it a little bit more. Now this article was just published, but the experience happened in 2011. Do the math on how long this has been out there that this guy has been testing to see if really he can eat food. All right, so he goes on, he continues to eat food. The doctors start testing him. It gets to the point they remove the feeding tubes. So for 16 years, he had never tasted food, and now suddenly he is leading a completely normal life. The doctors have no explanation for it. None at all, apart from the prayer. So here's what you have. You have medical documented evidence of a disease. You have a complete medical history, including all the different therapies that they went through to try to get this guy healthy and get him to a point where at least he could tolerate eating food. You have this story of the healing. Then you have the follow-up research of them testing it, looking at the different theories, what possibly could have happened. Is this going to be consistent? Let's make sure we don't take the feeding tube out too early. Okay, it's out. He is still doing good. This is 8 years after the event. He's still doing all right and eating food. All of that, a publication in a scientific journal. All of that. And you know what? People, maybe even some of you in this room, are going to go, yeah, right. Like that actually happened. Something else is going on. There's no way that he had something wrong. This is fake. He really faked it. He faked defeating 2 for 16 years. His parents faked defeating 2 for 16 years. They were sneaking him Doritos when he was asleep, you know. Sometimes we all can be guilty of this. No amount of evidence, no amount of anything is going to convince us that something actually happened, because quite honestly, we just don't want to believe it. We ask for evidence, we get it, we still question it. We ask for more evidence, we get it, we still question it. And finally it gets to the point where everybody has to do one of two things. They have to continue asking for evidence and getting it, or they have to finally say, look, I've got everything that I need to say whether I believe this or not, and I just need to make my decision. Am I going to believe what I'm being presented with, or am I not? And for the ones presenting the evidence, then eventually the point has to come for us. We have to say, I'm done. I've given you everything I got. You got to do with it what you want, but this is all that I have for you. Now, as we look at Jesus, of course, we know that as he traveled around, he did a lot of healing, right? That's kind of one of the things that Jesus did. Modern critics a lot of times will say, oh, that healing didn't really happen. It was a placebo effect. They were just mentally deranged or something like that, or they felt better because they thought that Jesus was doing this, so it was all fake. Well, in Jesus' day, people did generally accept the healings that were happening. They would actually acknowledge, yeah, something definitely happened in these healing areas for most of the time. For the most part. But there were a few occasions, like John chapter 9, and I know I've talked about the same story in the past few weeks, but honestly, it's just a phenomenal story. In John 9, you've got the guy who was born blind, very specific, born blind. No one had ever been healed of blindness if they were born blind. Totally unique situation. He's born blind, Jesus comes to him, heals him. The guy goes out, he's in the temple, and people still don't believe what happened. Hey, are you the guy who was born blind? Yeah. No, you're not. Last time I checked, I was. No, you look like him, but you're not actually him. Really? Okay, well, don't know what to tell you. I'm going to go ask your parents. Hey, is that your kid over there? Yeah. Born blind? Yeah. Are you sure? Are you sure he was blind? Yeah, we're sure he was blind. They've got everything going around this poor guy. Was he blind? Was he not blind? Yes, he was blind. I don't think he was true. I think you're all faking this. We just absolutely refuse to believe that this guy is the one who was born blind, or that he was born blind. He must have faked it for his entire life growing up. It wasn't for lack of evidence. They just didn't want to believe it. And it's interesting that a lot of the times that people that do ask for the evidence and they want the sign, they want the proof, when you give it to them, they are just going to reject it. It's like, why waste my breath? Because you're not going to believe it anyways. Why engage in the conversation? And these same Pharisees and these same Sadducees that were questioning this poor blind guy who had received his sight, who were disbelieving in what Jesus was doing anyways, on 2 occasions, they go to Jesus and they say, give us a sign. The first is in Matthew 12. Before they came to him, Jesus had already healed people. He had forgiven sins. He had cast out demons. He had raised the dead. And they come to him and they say, hey, Jesus, can you give us a sign? Jesus says, I'm not giving you anything except for the sign of Jonah. He explains it back then as just as Jonah was in 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. So the second time is in Matthew 16, which is the passage that Tish read today. In between Matthew 12 and Matthew 16, Jesus walks on water between two different feedings. He feeds over 9,000 people, and he does more healings. And they come back to him, and this time they say, can you give us a sign from heaven? Prove it right now. Come on. Let's go, Jesus. What are you going to show me from heaven? Miracle. We like things on demand, don't we, though? We're in an on-demand age. Everything is on demand. Video on demand, phone calls on demand. You throw it in the microwave, and that takes too long. But they wanted something immediately, and not just any miracle, because apparently miracles were different from signs, and there were other miracle workers that were out there. And when you really read the text, a lot of times it wasn't so much that the Pharisees and Sadducees were concerned about the miracles themselves, but they didn't like the fact that Jesus did a lot of them on the Sabbath. That was really ultimately what the problem was. But if he really was the Son of God, then he should be able to ask for anything he wants, any great sign, and he would be able to do it right away. So why does Jesus say, essentially, not right now, guys? See, it's not very often that people in the Bible actually did ask for a sign. It did happen on occasion. You have Gideon, who after God told him that he was going to go and defeat all of Israel's enemies, that he was the one who was going to do it. Gideon was not exactly a brave guy, and so he asked for a sign. Lord, make the fleece wet, make the fleece dry. Help me out here. Elijah, when he was confronting the prophets of Baal, he asked for a sign from heaven. He did say, God, consume this sacrifice. Show them that you are the one who is real. In Joshua 6, the people asked God to keep the sun in the sky standing still so that they could defeat their enemy at that time. God responded in those ways. But I want to point out that in every single one of those, these are people who believed that God could do those things, believed that they expected God would do those things. There was already a faith that was there of, God, you can do this. I need some help just to make sure this is right. So can you please help me make sure I'm on the right track? And there were a few times when we could say that God himself offered a sign from heaven. He took the initiative. He took the step to show his glory and to show who he was. No one asked for it. He just did it. Israel's wandering around the desert. They're complaining about food. And God says, you want food? I'll give you food. Don't worry about it. I'll give you manna and I'll make you sick of quail. In 2 Kings chapter 20, King Hezekiah of Judah, he's really sick. And Isaiah comes to him and says, you're going to get well. Hezekiah's like, I want to believe you, but can I have a sign so I know what you're saying is true? God says, yeah, you can have a sign, no problem. Which way do you want the sun to go? You want it to go forward or backwards? You want the shadow to go forward or backwards? I'll give you a sign, no problem. In Isaiah 7, Isaiah goes to King Ahaz, who is not exactly a godly king. They were under siege, and they're making plans for their defense, and Isaiah comes and says, this army is not going to do anything to you. They're not going to hurt you. They're going to go away. And God tells me that he wants you to come up with a sign that will prove what I'm saying is correct. You pick the sign. And Ahaz is like, yeah, no, I'm doing that. But that we do have from there, the Isaiah 7:14, behold, the virgin shall conceive. And the one who is born to you shall be called Emmanuel. So we have those occasions there where, yes, God will intervene. But this is the case here with the Sadducees and the Pharisees where they're not concerned. They don't believe anyways. They don't expect a sign. They don't think that Jesus is who he is. And so they're demanding of a sign. Jesus is just like, you're not going to believe it. He says, look around you. You know when it's going to rain. You can figure these things out. You make pretty good predictions on what's going to happen. But you can't even believe in the things that I am doing. When John the Baptist was in prison, he was questioning whether Jesus was the Messiah. And so he sent some of his disciples to Jesus. And Jesus says, go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, and those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. The Pharisees had enough info. They had enough proof. They had enough evidence. They just didn't want to believe it. And the interesting thing is when you look at the miracles of Jesus, when you look at the things that he did and when he went to people and he healed them, there's a phrase that happens quite a bit whenever he does these healings. Jesus saw their faith. Jesus was amazed by their faith. Never have I seen such faith. The people had some belief that Jesus would do and could do what it was that they were asking. They already believed. The miracle did not create faith most of the time. It didn't create it. It bolstered it. It grew it. It strengthened it. It didn't create it. The Pharisees were asking for a sign, in a sense, to force them to believe. Jesus is just like, you're not going to believe it. You come up with some excuse as to why it doesn't. But he does say again that this evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. Well, they'll receive none except for the sign of Jonah. So what is the sign of Jonah? Well, again, he explained it a little bit in Matthew 12 of Jonah, the prophet who is going where he's not supposed to go, gets swallowed by a fish, spends 3 days inside the fish, and then eventually gets spat out onto land. This is Jesus pointing forward to Easter. He's saying, you want to know what the sign is? All right, I'm going to disappear. I'm going to be gone for 3 days, and you're going to think I'm dead. You're going to think you're done with me. You're going to think I'm gone. But the surprise is when I come walking out of that tomb, and I'm still here, and I'm still alive, and I'm still doing what God wants me to do, because death cannot defeat me. You want a sign? I give you the resurrection. You'll see it in a little bit. So when we come to Jesus with requests, it really should not be in the sense of, Jesus, prove yourself by doing this for me, and do it now. Let me know that this is right. When Moses was being called to Egypt to lead Israel out, logically Moses is just like, hey, God, can you give me a sign to let me know that you really are with me and asking me to do this? And God says, yeah, I'll give you a sign. And here's what it is. I want you to go to Egypt, free Israel, bring them back here. And once they're free and you're back here and worshiping me on this mountain, then you'll know I was with you. Wait, you want me to do this before you give me the sign? Sometimes the sign that we receive is the fact that we actually did something. God will point forward to the future to say, you want to know that I'm going to come back? I promise you I'm going to come back. And how do you know? Because you'll see me when I come back. So I have to wait. Yes. So when we do encounter Jesus and when we do ask him for a sign, he's going to point us to 3 different places, to one of 3 or sometimes all 3. And one, he's going to point to the past. He's going to say, look at all the things I've already done. Look at all the work that has already been accomplished. Look at the things I've done for you. Look at the things I've done for others. He'll also point to the future. And he'll say, these are the things that I am going to do. And if I've done all these things in the past, my reputation is pretty good that I'm going to do this thing in the future as well. So how do you know who I am, who I say I am? Because I'm going to do this. But most importantly, for us, he points to the resurrection. Now for us, that's pointing back. But when Jesus was saying this, he was pointing towards it. Easter is almost here when we celebrate this resurrection. Because Jesus died. He didn't fake a death. He wasn't presumed to be dead. He was dead. And he came back to life, as he promised. If Jesus can do that, if Jesus did that, I am pretty sure that I do not need any more sign, any more evidence, any more proof on who he says he is or what it is that he says he is going to do. If Jesus rose from the dead, I can believe he's going to come back for me in the future. I can believe that sin and death will be destroyed. That is going to happen. I don't need proof. I don't need more signs. I have everything that I need already. Everything else is just like icing on the cake. It's just extra bits. It's just those tiny little bits of confirmations and those reminders. Responding in faith to Jesus is not because he has already done that. It's about believing in his promises. So we can demand signs and we can demand proofs, but in the end, we have everything that we need right in front of us right now. And if we don't believe that, we're not going to believe anything that he has to offer. So let's take what we have. Take what we have, the evidence that is already there, and build our faith on that. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we do thank you that you have offered us so much proof as to who you are, of your working in our lives. We've been called to worship from Psalm 19, about you speaking through nature, speaking through the world around us, to even things like this article that was in the journal. Proof of you still working. Lord, we know that these are just things to emphasize the faith that we already have. We just pray you would make yourself more real to us, that we would be able to look back to the things that you've done, recognize the things you've done, and from that build our faith into the things that is you're going to be doing in the future. Lord, speak to us this morning, draw us close to you, and transform us into your image. Amen. At this time, we're going to enter into a period of open worship where we can say how God has been speaking to us throughout the past week. So if you feel led, please feel free to stand and share, and let us edify one another.